All eyes are on the Hawkeye State this week. Several Republican presidential candidates are going to be in Iowa, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. There is a long list of candidates looking to win over voters in that state right now. Former President Trump, though, has a commanding lead in the polls. A recent poll shows he's ahead of Florida Governor DeSantis in Iowa by 42 points. He also has a big lead nationally. Joining me now, Republican strategist Boyd Matheson. He also served as the chief of staff to Senator Mike Lee of Utah and as a radio host in Salt Lake City. Always great to see you, Boyd. Thanks for being here. So how badly does Ron DeSantis need to connect with voters and win them over in Iowa this week?
Good morning, Marni. And yeah, it is that person-to-person contact that makes the difference in Iowa. We talk a lot about the polls and what that looks like, but at this stage of the game, it's really about the process. It's about organizing on the ground. And I think that'll be one of the real challenges for Governor DeSantis is can he make that person-to-person connection that's so vital, not only in Iowa, but in New Hampshire and in South Carolina. It's really interesting, Marni. He obviously has a lot of money. He's been touting the money. He's been talking about how many people he was going to get in terms of paid staff on the ground. And the thing that I found in campaigns is cash flow covers a multitude of problems and weaknesses. Whenever you're talking about how much you're going to spend to do something, that's a big red flag to me, because in these early states in particular, it's about grassroots. It's not about paid people. You got to have grassroots, not just the grass tops or even the AstroTurf people who are getting paid to do it. So that authenticity matters a lot. And I think that will be the real test for Governor DeSantis.
And some have been critical of him for that. What do you think he needs to do, not only to be authentic, but to differentiate himself, the advantages he has when he shares a lot of similarities in ideals with former President Trump?
Yeah, I think the real key is to focus less on the former president and more on the vision for the future. I think that's the real key. If he's just doing a battle backward facing with the former president, I don't actually think that's a winning strategy for him. I think the more he can focus on quick hits of what he's done as governor, not focusing on Florida, but focusing on how he would apply it in the Oval Office, and then a vision for the future of the country. I think that he's got to get on a message. People want to be part of a winning story, and he's got to tell that story. And he's got to tell it in a really personal way. And he can't do that just from behind the microphone. He's got to do that hand to hand, going to a lot of events there in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina.
What about the former president? He'll be holding a private meeting with pastors. What do you make of that setup, unlike what we've seen from him in the past?
Yeah, really interesting, isn't it, that he's not going for the big rally moment. I think he realizes that he's got to get to that one-on-one stuff back in Iowa. Remember, he didn't win Iowa in the 2016 case, and part of that was because he did just big rallies. And so I think he's got to go back, especially into those faith communities. He's got to tell a different kind of story and a different kind of vision, because I really think in those communities in particular, Marni, if this is backward-facing grievance politics, I think that faith community really does want to have some hope in the future, not just looking in the rearview mirror of where we've been.
Does a growing Republican field, Boyd, serve as an advantage to Trump?
You know, I think it does in terms of the national polls, because it just divides things out a little bit further. I think you're going to see a few of those in that growing list of potentials, that there'll be a few of those that will start to emerge with a message, and that's where things will start to change. Again, remember, it's not about what those national polls, even the statewide polls are a little bit too broad right now. Again, it's organization, it's process that's really the king.
And of the faces that we've got on the screen right now, I mean, Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, made one of the more recent announcements. Who do you expect to emerge with that type of message that resonates?
Yeah, I think Senator Scott is one of those who will definitely emerge. There's clearly a lane for him in terms of that positive message and a vision for the future. He's going to go into Iowa. He's going to talk about education. He's going to talk about the fact that if you want kids to have a chance, the parents have to have a choice. They can't be consigned just because of their zip code. He's also going to talk about the opportunity zones, and that will extend well beyond Iowa and New Hampshire. That'll be into a lot of the bigger states, where he's looking at talking to the African-American community, the inner cities, and saying, look, don't look to the government. The government's going to give you exactly what you need to stay exactly where you are. And he's going to talk about some policies that will hopefully create that upward momentum and that upward mobility that we really need in all of our society.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.